This one was frustrating because things actually looked pretty good early on. The team was moving the ball, controlling the game, and giving us plenty of reasons to feel encouraged. Then everything changed, and suddenly we were watching a completely different performance. There were some really promising moments, but there were also a few things that should definitely have fans talking after this one. If you're ready to break it all down, hit that like button and drop a "Go Hawks" in the comments if you're with me. The Seattle Seahawks walked away from this preseason game with a 19-6 loss to the Tennessee Titans. But the final score does not tell the full story of what happened. In fact, the most frustrating part of this game might be just how different Seattle looked from the beginning to the end. Early on, the Seahawks were controlling the action, moving the football and showing noticeable improvement compared with the previous week. By the second half, however, almost everything that had been working disappeared. And that contrast is where this game becomes really interesting. The Seahawks essentially had around 240 yards by halftime, and the offense operating with Drew Lock looked much more comfortable moving the football. Seattle was getting up and down the field, sustaining possessions, and creating opportunities. There were points left on the field as well, including missed kicks that could have put Seattle in a considerably better position. But once the third group entered the game, led by Jalen Milroe, the offense became stuck. The points stopped coming. The yards disappeared. The third down numbers moved in the wrong direction, the time of possession advantage disappeared, and Seattle simply could not consistently advance the football. That is why this 19-6 result feels more complicated than simply saying the Seahawks played badly. There were genuinely encouraging things happening during the first half. The defense looked good. The offense looked good. Seattle appeared to be moving in the right direction. Then the second half arrived, and suddenly the defense could not consistently stop the run while the offense could not move the football. There is important context here because many of the players who struggled later in the game were Seattle's threes, and plenty of those players will not make the final roster. At the same time, some of them will, and some players fighting for those final spots needed to show more. One number that cannot be ignored is 14 penalties. 14. Regardless of which unit was responsible for each individual flag, that is far too many penalties for one game. It contributed to a performance where Seattle started well, but gradually lost control as the game continued. And then we arrive at perhaps the biggest offensive conversation coming out of this game. Drew Lock and Jalen Milroe. Based strictly on what happened on the field in this game, there was a major difference between them. Lock looked in command. He was basically perfect through his first 10 or 11 throws, and the offense appeared comfortable with him running it. He looked like the quarterback who should be Seattle's backup based on this performance. Milroe's appearance was much more difficult. This does not mean everything that went wrong was his responsibility. The offensive line did not always help him, and he delivered a pass to Rell that should have been caught. But overall, Milroe looked uncomfortable and still very much like a player trying to figure things out at this level. That becomes particularly noteworthy because the reports discussed from OTAs, minicamp, and training camp had included positive things about Milroe and his development. The problem is that when the preseason games have arrived, those positive developments have not consistently translated to the field. And that creates a difficult question for Seattle. How patient should the Seahawks be with Milroe when the final 53-man roster is being assembled? The conversation about potentially moving on from him sounds dramatic, but after this particular performance, it is at least a question being raised. He did not look ready to be the backup quarterback in this game, while Lock looked considerably more prepared to handle that responsibility. That does not erase everything Milroe has apparently done during camp. It also does not mean one preseason performance automatically determines his entire future. But the Seahawks have decisions coming, and the game tape is part of the evidence they have to evaluate. There was another offensive player who made Seattle's roster decisions more complicated in a completely different way: Jacardia Wright. Wright had an impressive performance, highlighted by a big touchdown run, and he may have made it considerably harder for Seattle to simply move on from him. Depending on how the Seahawks decide to construct the roster, there could be a scenario where Wright becomes the fourth option, particularly if Zach Charbonnet starts on PUP. That is exactly what players on the edge of a roster are supposed to do during the preseason. Give the coaches a reason to reconsider the numbers. Wright did that. Elijah Arroyo also produced an encouraging moment, making a big catch and contributing early in the game. Montorie Foster Jr. continued giving Seattle something to think about as well. He made one big catch and nearly came away with another diving play that could have resulted in an enormous gain or potentially a touchdown. Ricky White appeared to have some positive moments too, while Cody White experienced the other side of preseason football. A significant fumble could prove costly when a player is competing near the bottom of the roster. When the margin between making the team and being left off the 53 is already small, mistakes like that become difficult to ignore. And this is where preseason football can be brutal. The scoreboard says Seattle lost by 13 points. But for many of these players, the more important result is happening inside individual evaluations. One run, one catch, one fumble, one missed assignment, or one defensive play can change how a player is viewed when roster decisions arrive. Defensively, there is also context that needs to be considered before judging Seattle's second-half performance too harshly. Will Levis, a quarterback who has been a starter in the league, was running much of the third quarter against Seattle. Tennessee had many of its ones playing during the first half, many of its twos playing into the beginning of the third quarter, and did not get deeply into its threes until later. Seattle, meanwhile, was essentially working with twos and threes. Even Jeffrey Simmons played in this game for Tennessee. Considering that difference in personnel, there were Seahawks defenders who absolutely helped themselves. Chris Paul Jr. was one of the biggest examples. He needed to produce a strong performance, and he was flying into people and making his presence felt. After Tyrese Knight had produced an impressive showing in the previous game, this was an opportunity for Paul to answer with his own performance, and he did exactly that. Connor O'Toole was another player who kept appearing around important defensive plays. He got to the quarterback repeatedly and came away with at least one sack, or at minimum should have been credited with one based on the immediate reaction to the game. For somebody described as being on the fringe of Seattle's roster, that kind of night matters. When you are fighting for one of the final places on the 53-man roster, you cannot control every variable. You can control whether coaches notice you. O'Toole made himself noticeable. Chaz Surratt was flying around and making plays early as well. He did not play as much later in the game, but when he was on the field, he made an impact. Andre Fuller also received additional playing time because of what became the most concerning development of the entire night: the injury to Bud Clark. Clark left the game early on a cart with an air cast. At the time of this instant reaction, there was no additional information available about the injury, and there is no reason to speculate beyond what was actually known. The visible circumstances were obviously concerning, but Seattle had not provided further information at that point. With Clark leaving, Fuller was asked to handle more work, and he responded with a fairly impressive performance that included multiple tackles and a pass breakup. Then there is Nehemiah Pritchett, another player whose roster situation deserves attention. Pritchett was already described as being on the fringe of making this team, and the arrival of Trevon Diggs has made the competition even more complicated. Diggs did not play in this game, but his presence on the roster matters when Seattle begins calculating how many defensive backs it can keep. Pritchett had also been slowly losing ground to Noel Williams, making these remaining evaluations especially important. And this is what makes the 19-6 loss much more than a disappointing final score. Seattle showed two completely different versions of itself. The first version moved the football, controlled possession, defended effectively, and gave the impression that the improvement from the previous week was real. Drew Lock commanded the offense. Several roster bubble players created positive moments. The Seahawks were competitive even while Tennessee was using significant portions of its stronger personnel. Then everything changed. The offense stalled. The running defense struggled. Seattle accumulated far too many penalties. Milroe struggled to establish control of the offense, and players fighting for roster positions experienced both potentially roster-saving moments and potentially costly mistakes. The Seahawks clearly still have work to do, and this game provided the coaching staff with plenty of material to evaluate before the roster is finalized. There were encouraging performances buried inside a frustrating loss, but there were also issues that cannot simply be dismissed because this was preseason football. The biggest question may now be how Seattle evaluates the difference between what Milroe has reportedly shown during practices and what he has shown when these preseason games begin. Drew Lock made a strong case with his performance, while Milroe's struggles made the quarterback depth conversation considerably more difficult. At the same time, players like Wright, Paul, O'Toole, Surratt, Fuller, and others gave Seattle additional decisions to consider. Some players took advantage of their opportunities. Others may have allowed an opportunity to slip away. And with roster decisions getting closer, those individual moments could matter far more than the 19-6 score everyone sees at the top of the page. So after watching Seattle start this game so strongly before everything changed in the second half, what do you have to say about this performance? And what should the Seahawks do about Jalen Milroe? Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the latest Seahawks news. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button because it helps us keep bringing you more Seahawks coverage. And now, click the video that's on your screen and keep watching, because the latest Seahawks updates and breaking news, you'll find them here first.